and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 43, Insert Well-Known Idiom Here. Since we began the history of Rome some 50-odd episodes ago, I've covered some pretty obscure stuff. Things that have long been forgotten by all but professional scholars and a few amateur enthusiasts. Indeed, I was drawn to the idea of producing this podcast specifically to shed light on some of these oft-ignored stories. The next few episodes will be a bit different, though. This week, we are going to start dealing with things that are so famous that they have worked their way well into our collective imagination. For the next little while, it's going to be all the die is cast, I came, I saw, I conquered, et tu Brute, and I come here not to praise Caesar, but to bury him. We're about to delve into events and personalities that are almost universally recognizable. That the language of Caesar's civil war still sits on the tips of our tongues is a testament to the massive impact it had on the development of the Western world. Because what do you say when you want to express that someone has gone past the point of no return? Ah yes, you say that they are crossing the Rubicon. As the winter of 50 BC came to a close, Caesar and the Senate had reached an impasse. Caesar refused to obey a direct order from the Senate to stand down his army, and the Senate refused to grant any of the concessions Caesar demanded in exchange for his cooperation. Both sides accused the other of upending the rule of law for the sake of private ambition. Caesar pointed out that the Senate did not technically have the authority to order him to give up his command, as his proconsulship did not legally expire for another 2 years. The Senate replied that technically Caesar's entire career was one blatant act of criminality after another, and he ought not go around touting legal technicalities as a defense. But before we go any further into the story, I think it's worth reiterating just what had led to this impasse. A comment by Lane attached to last week's episode asked some very good questions about exactly what criminal charges Caesar faced if he returned to Rome, and why the relationship between the Senate and Caesar had grown so acrimonious. The two feed off each other, so I'll answer the last question first. In his survey of the Roman Republic called, coincidentally, The Roman Republic, Michael Crawford makes the point over and over again that after the plebs were integrated fully into the political process, an oligarchy of wealthy families on both sides of the original class divide found their interests generally aligned. From about the 350s on, and especially after the Senate came to dominate the state during the Second Punic War, there was a great deal of pressure from within this oligarchy to not sell one another out. That is, when internal disputes emerged, for example, the rivalry between the Fabii and the Claudii families, they were not allowed to spill out into the lower socioeconomic orders. For hundreds of years, these families bred amongst themselves and protected the property and privileges their status afforded them. So even if two old patricians hated each other, one wouldn't turn to the popular assemblies with promises of land reform in order to put pressure on the other. Threats to upend the established order were dealt with swiftly and harshly, usually in the form of social ostracism. To the highly social Romans, this was a fate worse than death, and it had the effect of keeping everyone in the upper class pretty much on the same page. But by the end of the Punic Wars, this solidarity began to break down. The long wars with Carthage had decimated the ranks of the old aristocratic families, and the upper classes became populated with novus homo, men who were new to power and had no great loyalty to the old oligarchs. They identified with the masses and had no compunction about using popular causes as a means to leverage personal power. Marius was a great force in this transition, and once he showed how the new game could be played, ambitious men were eager to follow his lead. Suddenly, rather than ignoring the masses, praetors and consuls were proposing land reform and grain doles that flew in the face of everything the old order stood for. Because what the old order stood for more than anything else was the monopolization of land and trade by a few select families. Into this environment stepped Caesar, scion of an ancient patrician family, who turned his back on that status to champion popular causes as a way to reach the top of the political ladder. I've been reading H.W. Brands' biography of Franklin Roosevelt, called Traitor to His Class, and I would say that there is a great deal of similarity between American upper-class hatred of that man in the White House and the Senate's hatred of Caesar. In both cases, Charismatic leaders who ought to have been strident defenders of the privileges of the old order instead used their considerable skills to blow those privileges up. The title of Brands's book says it all. They were traitors to their class. Because of this betrayal, the conservative Senate hated Caesar. They could see their way of life slipping away and were trying desperately to stem the tide of reform. And here was this enormously talented politician who ought to have been helping them, not helping them, and instead making things even worse. And not only that, he seemed to enjoy watching them squirm. So they were eternally vigilant for the moment that they could turn the tables and watch him squirm for a change. They finally saw their opportunity as the war in Gaul wound down. Cato and his allies were going to go after Caesar in court as soon as he lost the cloak of immunity that came with holding public office. But the question is, what was the Senate planning to actually charge him with, and what would that punishment actually be if he was convicted? There were complaints large and small, some frivolous, and some not even true. But leading the way was the entirely accurate charge of bribery and his sacrilegious conduct as consul. Now, bribery was pretty common practice at the time, so the further question is, why was Caesar being singled out? The answer is that bribery was tolerated as long as everyone involved exercised a little discretion. But bribery turned from accepted under-the-table practice to scandal when it came out into the open, and Caesar didn't even bother to hide what he was doing. He would brag about not having to worry about this or that because he had paid off a tribune or an influential senator. It made everyone crazy. No one had clean hands, except for maybe stodgy old Cato, but Caesar was making a mockery of their gentlemanly agreements. This break in social custom, coupled with the amounts and extent of his bribery, was what made people want to teach him a lesson. Was it selective prosecution? Definitely. Did the Senate care about the hypocrisy of it all? Not even a little bit. Caesar's brazen public purchase of the electoral system threatened to unmask the democratic facade the oligarchs had built around the republic. They had to do something. Aside from the bribery issue, was the little matter of the entire second half of Caesar's consulship. You'll recall that Bibulus had devised a clever scheme to stop Caesar's reforms by declaring every remaining day of their shared consulship a holy day, and thus closed to public business. You'll also recall that Caesar's reaction to this was to ignore the decree completely. His attitude was to get done what he wanted to get done and worry about the consequences later. Well, now it was later, and no one had forgotten what he had done. By ignoring the holy days, Caesar had committed acts that were not just illegal, they were sacrilegious. To the highly religious Romans, Caesar's blasphemy could not go unpunished, or it would invite the wrath of the gods on the entire empire. So there Caesar is in Gaul, hated by a pretty good chunk of the political elite, who are going to prosecute him for things that no one could possibly argue he did not do. All he could hope for was leniency, but that hated thing seemed to preclude any chance of that. So what's the worst he could expect if he was brought up on charges and found guilty? I've looked all over, and I can't find any mention of execution being considered, and I don't think that even Caesar thought it would come to that. The worst he probably expected was banishment, or fines that would send him to the poorhouse. But the worst was not the thing that kept Caesar up at night. The thing that kept him up at night was the fairly banal fact that if he was tried and convicted, he would be politically marginalized. He had dedicated his life to becoming a man of influence, a man of power, the first man in Rome, and a criminal conviction would erase all that. In essence, Caesar plunged Rome into chaos, violence, and civil war because he was afraid of losing his status. As much as there is to admire about Caesar, and there is much to admire, we should not forget that he was an enormously selfish man who killed tens of thousands of his fellow citizens because he did not want to retire to a life of obscurity. And there is nothing much to admire about that. So it is in this light that we should see Caesar's final reply to the Senate's order in the winter of 50 BC to stand down his army. He told them he could not comply, and that if they forced the issue, he would defend his honor by any means necessary. The Senate, even the moderates, were incensed by these fighting words and felt compelled to follow through on their threats. Caesar was declared an enemy of the state. In the Senate House that day were a number of Caesar's supporters who argued loudly that this was unjust and beyond the pale. When the majority moved to expel Caesar's allies, one in particular raised a tremendous commotion. He had been elected tribune for that year, and when the guards came to remove him and his promised veto, he shouted that he was sacrosanct, and that to lay hands on him was to invite the wrath of the gods. But the senators had heard enough and pitched the troublemaker out onto the street. The tribune dusted himself off and immediately headed north to Caesar's camp. Upon arrival, Caesar displayed the tribune's bruises to his assembled troops as proof of the Senate's evil ways. "I fight to defend the people of Rome," he said, while the Senate viciously attacks their representatives. Now, of course, the aggrieved tribune in question, a one Mr. Marcus Antonius, better known as Mark Antony, was no great friend of the people, and never had been. He had been born into a wealthy plebeian family, and cared very little for much of anything at all beyond his own base pleasures. He loved wine, women, and gambling, and had spent his youth endlessly carousing the streets of Rome with his friends, causing trouble and running up massive debts. He seemed destined to spend his life as a no-account, spoiled little rich boy, but as it turned out, he was called to Syria to serve in the cavalry and immediately distinguished himself as one of the finest officers in the legions. He was a crude and reckless disaster in his private life, but put a helmet on him, give him a few men, and point him at the enemy, and he was able to accomplish extraordinary things. His mother was first cousins with Caesar, and in 54 BC, the young officer was attached to the great general's staff in Gaul. Though he was almost 20 years Caesar's junior, the two struck up an immediate friendship. In Antony, Caesar seems to have found not just another accomplice or temporary ally or partner, but in fact a true friend. Antony would spend the next 10 years as Caesar's most trusted commander and a dogged defender of his interests wherever Caesar sent him, for example, to Rome to serve as tribune in 50 BC. Today, he showed off his bruises and stirred the troops up into an anti-senatorial frenzy. He knew his role, and he played it well. Having been declared an enemy of the state for refusing to surrender his army, Caesar knew that it would only be a matter of time before Pompey would be ordered north to take him out. His only real hope was to audaciously preempt the Senate's inevitable attack by marching straight for Rome at lightning speed. Maybe the unexpected invasion would cause enough chaos in the city that Pompey would find himself unprepared for a fight, forcing the old general to strategically withdraw from Rome. Caesar did not feel he even had time to wait for reinforcements from Gaul, so on January the 10th, 49 BC, he ordered the one legion he had on hand, the 13th, to follow him across the tiny Rubicon River, which marked the southern border of Cisalpine Gaul, into Italia proper, an overt act of treason. Not only was it illegal for a general to lead an army out of the province he governed, it was doubly illegal to take an army into the home peninsula. Caesar knew what he was doing when he ordered the 13th across, but not what the final outcome of his actions would be. Famously, watching his troops wade into the river, he said, "The die is cast." They were all in the hands of fate now, whatever her fickle verdict turned out to be. Initiating a civil war by invading Italy with a single legion may have been completely nuts, but if they were all in fate's hands anyways, how does the expression go? Fortune favors the bold. Now, neither Caesar nor the Senate had access to Roman history books to tell them that Caesar's decision to cross the Rubicon would mark the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Imperium, and we shouldn't ascribe motives to anyone beyond what the immediate context merits. Even the Senate, whose rhetoric clearly signaled they believed Caesar to be a dire threat to the Republic, couldn't possibly have known that they would be so right. The Republic had survived the Gracchi, Marius, and Sulla. Caesar was cut from the same cloth, but had not those men come and gone while the Republic remained? So yes, Caesar knew when he crossed the river that he was sparking a civil war, and that if he was going to survive, he was going to have to seize power. But that he would set a precedent for 500 years of emperors? Standing there on the banks of the Rubicon on that cold January morning, Caesar was thinking about how best to approach Rome and what resistance he might face from his fellow countrymen. He was thinking about his supply lines and whether or not to overwhelm Italy or detour to Spain to cut off Pompey's armies there so they couldn't reinforce his opponent. Was he thinking that in 2,000 years the Russians would be ruled by a Tsar and the Germans by a Kaiser? That in the future his name would literally be synonymous with autocracy? Probably not. He was marching into Italy with but a single legion to overthrow the greatest state in the ancient world. He had other things on his mind. The reaction in Rome was exactly what Caesar hoped it would be. The Senate heard that he was invading and immediately fell over themselves, calling for Pompey to save them. The old general had 2 legions at his disposal, but critically, no one seemed to know how large of a force was marching on Rome. The last time Pompey had checked, Caesar only had the 13th with him. Surely he was not foolish enough to invade with just a few thousand men. So it was safe to assume that the outlawed general had been reinforced. Pompey's imagination got the better of him as he pictured Caesar coming south at the head of 10 veteran legions. It would be suicide to stay in Rome. So Pompey, playing right into Caesar's hands, ordered an immediate withdrawal of the city. He would take his legions, and anyone else who cared to come with him, to Brundisium, and from there they would sail for Greece. The senators were appalled, but Pompey calmly explained that the East was where he had made his name, and he had a string of clients willing to support their patron at the drop of a hat. Caesar could have Rome for now, but the occupation would be short-lived. Pompey would gather a massive army in Greece, and then return to Italy to crush the upstart. They were welcome to stay in Rome and await Caesar's arrival if they wished, but he was going to Greece. The Senate, almost to a man, followed. They didn't even bother to lock the gates. On his way south, Caesar found most of the Italian towns amenable to his approach. This he considered a blessing, as he desperately wanted there to be no resistance whatsoever. Despite the propaganda he was issuing about how he was the victim and how he was the true defender of the people and how he was the Republic, he knew full well that he was committing treason. If he was going to skate through this, he would need his fellow citizens to be complicit in the whitewashing of his coup d'etat. The last thing he needed was to be seen killing and pillaging peaceful Italian towns. At one point, though, a city garrisoned by a conservative general did attempt to hold out, but Caesar managed to convince him to surrender without spilling blood. When the general and his captains emerged from behind the walls, they fully expected to be executed, but Caesar released them, going so far as to tell them that they could go join up with Pompey and continue to fight him if that's what they thought was best. Everyone was shocked by this display of leniency. Caesar didn't even make them promise not to oppose him in the future. But Caesar knew exactly what he was doing. He was weaving a spell of legitimacy around himself, and the spell would only work if he didn't give anyone an excuse to point out that he was engaged in criminal conquest. There could be no martyrs. He was the friend of everyone, even his enemies. It drove both his friends and enemies crazy, but the people caught in the middle would remain on the sidelines as long as Caesar did nothing to provoke them. With Pompey headed south with a head start, Caesar's main motivation at this point was not to make straight for Rome, but rather to march for Brundisium as fast as possible and try to cut off access to the port city. If he could keep Pompey from reaching Greece, he might be able to force a resolution to the conflict before the end of the year. As the two armies raced for Brundisium, envoys from both camps traveled back and forth, exchanging proposals and counter-proposals to secure a peace before things got out of hand. More than anything, Caesar wanted to meet privately with Pompey. If the two of them could get together alone, he was sure they could hash out a peace. But the Senate was adamant that Pompey not agree to the terms. They were certain that dynamic Caesar would convince old Pompey to sell out the Senate and renew their previous alliance. All attempts at talk were foiled. Despite Caesar's double-time pace, Pompey reached Brundisium first and fortified the city. Caesar arrived not long after and laid siege, including an attempt to blockade the port, but his efforts failed, and ships from Greece were able to spirit Pompey and the Senate away. Caesar was now in control of Italy, but it was a hollow victory. The entire Republican governing apparatus had fled the peninsula. Even with his mastery of propaganda, it would be hard for Caesar to convince anyone that his control of Italy was legitimate. But there was no time to worry about that now. He wheeled around and headed to Rome, marching into the city in April of 49 BC. It was awkward marching his army into the unprotected city. There was no resistance, but there was also no support. He called a meeting of the Senate to plead his case, but it was a sparsely attended affair, and those who remained in the city were all B-list nobodies anyway. Everyone that mattered was already gone. He received a much more enthusiastic welcome when he addressed the popular assemblies, promising them cash and grain under his administration. But they immediately turned on him when he looted the public treasury to help pay his soldiers. To make matters worse, a stubborn tribune had made a point of physically standing between Caesar and the treasury doors. After making such a big deal about the treatment of Mark Antony, Caesar's hypocrisy was in full display as he threatened to kill the obstinate tribune if he did not clear a path. After seizing the cash and resupplying his army, Caesar was savvy enough to know that he best get out of the city before he damaged his standing any more than he already had. This was a political conflict as much as it was a military affair, and losing on either front would cripple his long-term goals. Though he had done himself no favors with his conduct in Rome, military victory would go a long way towards solving his political problems. So leaving Mark Antony in charge of the city, Caesar led his legions out the gate. Caesar decided to put off chasing after Pompey for now, and instead resolved to neutralize any support that may come in from Spain. In an amazing 27 days, Caesar marched his legions from Rome to Spain, picking up additional forces in Gaul along the way. He entered Hispania with some 30,000 troops, intent on taking the Spanish legions out of the fight before Pompey could figure out how to put them to good use. He had expected to meet limited resistance from Pompey's 5 leaderless legions, but the commanders left in charge had no intention of rolling over for Caesar. When the two forces met in battle briefly for an initial skirmish, the Pompeian legions showed surprising resiliency in the field, throwing back Caesar's men, who had grown accustomed to easy victory. But success in the field would not be enough. The local Spanish tribes concluded that if they helped Caesar win control of the empire, he may repay the favor by easing the burden of servitude imposed by Rome. The Pompeian forces soon found themselves bottled up without access to allies or supplies. To prevent any escape, Caesar camped his army practically on top of the enemy, and soon soldiers from both sides began to slip back and forth between the opposing camps to drink and commiserate over what a miserable lot they had all drawn. Fighting fellow Romans is not why any of them had joined up. In particular, the foot soldiers in the Pompeian legions were jealous of Caesar's men, who had grown rich, being led by the great general, while they wasted away supporting a pack of rich old men who didn't care about them anyway. It didn't help when the Pompeian commanders cracked down hard on the intermingling, while Caesar turned a blind eye to the enemy soldiers drinking in his own camp. Soon enough, though, the commanders, out of food and supplies, joined in their soldiers' dissatisfaction. They weren't going to starve to death defending the honor of a bunch of senators. They surrendered, and when Caesar disbanded the defeated legions, the vast majority of them turned right around and signed up to fight for the man who had just defeated them. Stronger than ever, Caesar marched back to Italy. When he arrived in Rome this time, in December of 49 BC, things went quite a bit better. Allies had managed to formalize an appointment to the office of dictator, giving Caesar legal powers he had not had previously. But unlike Marius and Sulla, who had used their powers to murder their enemies, Caesar showed amazing restraint, turning his attention away from revenge and toward the grain supply problems and economic meltdowns that had been caused by the Civil War. Quickly reorganizing the logistics and finances of the state, Caesar then resigned his dictatorship, declaring his intention to serve merely as a consul, which, he reminded everyone, was all he wanted anyway. The citizens of Rome were amazed, and it did much to repair the damage he had done in his first tour through the city. But he would not be staying in Rome for long. Now a consul, with at least a claim to legitimacy, Caesar headed to Brundisium with 7 legions. Pompey had spent the year gathering a massive international army, and it was a sure bet that come the spring they would be pouring back across the Adriatic. Most troubling for Caesar, who knew that his best shot lay in taking the fight to Pompey in Greece, was the fact that Pompey had some 600 ships patrolling the Adriatic, an impossible blockade if Caesar played it by the book, which clearly stated that he had to wait for spring, and that no one sailed the whole army across the Adriatic in winter. So Caesar threw the book out and ordered an unprecedented January crossing. If not for their fanatical loyalty, Caesar may have been faced with a full-blown mutiny, but instead his soldiers jumped into the crazy plan with relish. Even crazier, Caesar only had enough ships for about half his troops. He would have to send one convoy across, hope it could run the blockade, survive the dangerous seas, and hold a beachhead totally outnumbered in enemy territory. The odds of making it across unscathed one time were long, but Caesar then planned to do it all again a second time to bring over the rest of his troops. Fortune had better favor the bold. Pompey's fleet, ironically led by Caesar's old consular rival Bibulus, was totally unprepared for the January crossing, and Caesar led the first wave across intact and unchallenged. Enraged and embarrassed, however, Bibulus was well prepared for the second wave and prevented them from crossing. Caesar's old nemesis died not long after, and it was remarked that he had exerted himself so much in the wintry seas that he had literally worked himself to death. But he had left Caesar with half an army on the far side of the Adriatic, a fine parting gift from a man who had for so long been a thorn in Caesar's side. We'll leave Caesar there for now, camped in Epirus with half an army, surrounded by enemies. However, as next weekend contains both my own birthday and the soon-to-be Mrs. History of Rome's birthday, it'll be an extra week before we get to the final confrontation with Pompey at Pharsalus. The History of Rome will be back in 2 weeks for Caesar's final victory over the Senate and his return to Rome as the sole master of the greatest empire in the world. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 44, Caesar Triumphant. Last time, we left Caesar in a somewhat precarious position. Sorry about that, Caesar. On the far side of the Adriatic with only half his army. The rest of Caesar's men had been turned back by the naval blockade led by Bibulus, who died denying the second half of his old enemy's army an easy crossing. Pompey, with his well-supplied and much larger army, now numbering some 45,000, humming along nicely, he made no attempt to attack Caesar right away, even with the latter's army at half strength. He knew that Caesar was in a rotten position, and would soon discover that food for his men and horses would be hard to come by in this hostile country. Let the rebels starve. Best case scenario, they eventually surrendered, and no more Roman blood is spilled. Worst case scenario, they refuse to give up, and Pompey's well-fed army crushes Caesar's exhausted and starving troops. The smart play was definitely to wait. The contrasting styles of the two generals could not be more apparent during the coming campaign in Greece. Pompey was careful, methodical, and well-organized. He had no need to take risks because time and numbers were both on his side. Caesar, on the other hand, was flying by the seat of his pants, making it up as he went, and taking wild risks every step of the way. I think 99 times out of 100, the Pompey model beats the Caesar model, but every so often, that one shot pops up. Caesar may have been one of the most brilliant generals of the ancient world, but he was also, by his own admission, one of the luckiest. This luck was well on display when the two armies finally did meet at Dyrrhachium in May of 48 BC. In the months after his landing, Caesar used every channel he could think of to secure a truce with Pompey, from the highest diplomatic overtures to sending legionaries to the outskirts of Pompey's camp to try and get the foot soldiers on both sides to agree that fighting each other was crazy. Caesar pursued peace not only because he wanted to build the case that he was not the aggressor, but he was also in no position to actually, win a battle. It was this latter fact that kept Pompey and the Senate from taking Caesar's overtures too seriously. So as the winter slogged on, things were not looking good for Caesar. Not only were his men struggling on a subsistence diet, but he began to suspect that his allies in Italy were intentionally delaying the launch of the reinforcements Bibulus had turned back. Had he been betrayed? Had he foolishly rushed into his own destruction? A man of action, Caesar was unable to hold still, and even attempted to cross back across the wintry Adriatic Sea to fetch his missing troops, but was turned back by a storm. He was left to brood in his tent, racked with doubts about his position and his own abilities. But just as he was beginning to lose heart, Mark Antony lit a fire under the legions waiting in Brundisium and led them boldly across the Adriatic. Antony may have been crass, vulgar, and an unrepentant hedonist, but he was nothing if not a brilliant soldier and Caesar's most loyal captain. There was no way he was going to hang his general out to dry, even if more than a few people had whispered in his ear that he ought to do just that. When the spring came, the the reinforcements linked up with Caesar, bringing his numbers up to a respectable 15,000. Now at full strength, and with Antony at his side, Caesar felt confident about taking the fight to Pompey. By May, the Republic's army was camped just south of Dyrrhachium, a port city which lay directly across the Adriatic from Brundisium in modern Albania. In the dating for the rest of the war, I'm going to use the months the battles actually took place in, rather than the recorded historical dates. In just a few years, Caesar will reset the Roman calendar to reflect the drift caused by centuries of missing leap days, so the Battle of Dyrrhachium, which was recorded to have taken place in July, actually took place in mid-May, just as Pharsalus really took place in June, not August. The difference in dates may seem trivial, but to understand Pompey's hope that he would be able to starve Caesar into submission, you have to understand that everything took place before the harvest season, not after it, as the misaligned old calendar implied. So in May of 48 BC, Pompey was camped in a strong position with the sea and a link to endless supplies at his back, surrounded by steep hills. No direct assault was possible, so Caesar decided to try to recreate some of his success at Alesia and hem Pompey in. He ordered the same men who had built him a bridge across the Rhine in 10 days to build him a wall in a giant arc, starting at the sea north of Pompey's camp, running up and down the hills to the east, and then wrapping back around and connecting to the Adriatic in the south. He may not be able to prevent Pompey's access to food, but the wall would cut off his access to fresh water, and the critical pasture land Pompey's cavalry needed to feed their horses. Pompey responded by building his own parallel wall and trench system to keep Caesar's forces out in case they tried an open assault. Caesar notes in his commentaries on the civil wars that the two generals were essentially inventing entirely new ways to wage war as they went along. The ensuing weeks of siege and skirmishes fought in the no-man's land between the two walls has often been compared to the modern trench warfare of World War I rather than a classical era infantry battle. Men would launch themselves over their respective walls and attack, only to be repulsed by the superior defenses they assaulted. They would then return to the safety of their own walls, and the whole bloody drama would be played out in reverse. The stalemate was broken when a few Gallic officers defected to Pompey and brought with them information about the weak points in Caesar's wall. Pompey may have run his side of the war as conservatively as possible, but he could not ignore this opportunity. He pointed his men at the spots identified by the defectors and attacked immediately. Caesar tried to plug the hole, but failed miserably. He lost some 1,000 troops in the fighting and was forced to abandon his wall and retreat. But what initiative Pompey had shown by attacking was immediately negated by his hesitancy to pursue Caesar's fleeing army. The old general let Caesar's reputation for cleverness trip him up, and he convinced himself that Caesar was trying to lure him into a trap by running away. But there was no trap, just a pack of disorganized troops running away after getting their pants beat off. Collecting himself far inland, Caesar was amazed that he had managed to escape the day in one piece. He commented to one of his officers, "Today the victory had been the enemy's, had there been anyone among them to gain it." Caesar regrouped his army and marched inland, trying to put some distance between himself and Pompey. He had been badly shaken by the defeat at Dyrrhachium, but the fight had by no means gone out of him or his men. Some in the senatorial camp urged Pompey to now make straight away for Italy and retake Rome. But Pompey wisely understood that this was not a battle of territory, this was a battle of will. The objective was not to control Rome, it was to defeat Caesar. Anything less would be a false summit on the way up the mountain. By June, Caesar had been chased across northern Greece and was encamped near the town of Pharsalus in Thessaly, just on the other side of the mountains from the famous pass at Thermopylae. He now had about 20,000 troops all told, stronger than he had been, but numerically no match for the 45,000 Pompey had encamped 5 miles to the northwest. At Pharsalus, Pompey held the high ground and all the advantages of being in friendly country, and so was content to starve Caesar into submission. But he was surrounded by the Senate in exile, who pressed Pompey to attack and end the war once and for all. Every day, Caesar would march his army out onto the plain to offer battle, desperate for a conclusive fight, but Pompey would always decline. After a few days of light skirmishes, though, he finally gave in to pressure from the Senate and marched out in full force. He may have had misgivings about whether it was a good idea, But if it was a battle the Senate and Caesar wanted, a battle is what they would get. The Senate was overjoyed as they looked past the battle to a post-Caesar world. They argued in their tents about who would become Pontifex Maximus, who would be consul in the next year, how Caesar's estates would be divided. Everything, it seemed, but the battle itself. Caesar was not so distracted. The two armies were lined up with a river on Caesar's left and Pompey's right, making any attempt to flank the other on that front a non-starter. So both commanders looked to Caesar's right as the center of the action. Pompey massed all his cavalry on that flank and intended to smash through Caesar's weaker horsemen and then surround the small army. But Caesar immediately understood what Pompey's deployment meant and peeled off a cohort of men from each of his three lines and angled them as a fourth line as backup for his cavalry. He deployed this fourth line under cover of dust and the marching of his light skirmishers, so Pompey would not realize the additional wall of infantry existed. The battle began when Caesar ordered his first line in a frontal assault on Pompey's infantry, but Pompey had ordered his own troops to stand fast. Standard tactics of the day dictated that both sides should run headlong at each other and meet somewhere in the middle. But Pompey's plan was to force Caesar's veteran fighters to run the whole way, giving his own less experienced troops a slight advantage. But that veteran experience did not just mean they were better fighters. It also meant that they were more disciplined. When Caesar saw Pompey's troops staying put, he signaled his centurions to halt the charge just short of spear range to catch their breath. It is no small thing to halt the charge of an entire army when you have just whipped them into a murderous frenzy. But Caesar had trained his men well. When he said stop, they stopped. Only when they were sufficiently rested from their sprint did Caesar give the order to close the final distance. Just like that, his men turned back on the murderous frenzy and threw themselves against Pompey's line. The Battle of Pharsalus had begun. With the two infantries engaged, Pompey ordered his cavalry to break through according to the plan. They had no problem driving off Caesar's smaller cavalry, but when they cleared out the enemy horse, they suddenly found themselves confronted with an unexpected line of Caesar's heavy infantry. This time, it was Caesar's turn to defy convention. Usually, when confronted by charging cavalry, infantrymen would hurl their spears and then try to hack at the legs of the riders with their short swords. But Caesar ordered his men to hold on to their spears and use those to attack the heads of the riders. Totally surprised by this new tactic, Pompey's cavalry was completely thrown off and pulled up short, trying to avoid being stabbed in the face by spears. In just a few minutes, Caesar's fourth line had scattered the charging cavalry, and as soon as they had, the battle was as good as over. The fourth line charged forward and was able to sweep around behind Pompey's infantry. Besieged now on two fronts, Pompey's less experienced troops panicked, and the decisive battle of the Civil War turned quickly from titanic struggle for the future of Rome to complete and utter rout. Pompey himself seems to have snapped mentally when he saw his cavalry shattered and fled the battlefield, leaving his army to fend for itself. Seeing Pompey run ended any notion that the day might somehow be salvaged, and it soon became every man for himself. Senators who had just that morning been splitting up the inevitable spoils of victory now scattered in every direction. Caesar himself did not linger over his victory in the field, and immediately charged for Pompey's camp, hoping he could catch his defeated rival and finalize an official peace. But despite his speed, he could not get there in time. Pompey had gathered up his family, who had been with him since his flight from Rome, and abandoned the camp. He loaded up as much gold as he could, but was forced to leave behind most of his possessions when word came that Caesar was headed straight for him. He went so far as to throw off his general's cloak and disguise himself as a common camp follower to avoid capture. Pompey Magnus, who had fought his whole career for honor and glory, was reduced by defeat to a pathetic shadow of his former self, abandoning his troops and running for his life. But maybe that's too harsh. It was not for nothing that Pompey fled for Egypt, and not for nothing that he made sure he took with him as much gold as he could. The Senate had an ally in King Juba of Numidia, and Pompey's plan was likely to gather another army in North Africa, where allies of Caesar had just been defeated in that sub-theater of the greater civil war. But it was not to be. Court ministers in Alexandria, the capital of Egypt, learned that Pompey was headed their way and resolved to curry favor with Caesar by assassinating his enemy. When Pompey arrived at the Egyptian coast, he was greeted by a small skiff that was to take him to shore. But as soon as he was on board and separated from his bodyguards, the Egyptian welcoming party attacked. They stabbed Pompey repeatedly, murdering him there on the shores of Egypt, the second triumvir, to meet a violent end after a life spent chasing greatness. When Caesar heard the news, he was enraged. The conspiring ministers in Alexandria could not have been more wrong about what Caesar wanted, and their clever plan totally backfired. Rather than making a friend in Caesar, they had just cemented him as a furious enemy. See, Caesar's whole posture had always been one of the magnanimous victor, the generous statesman who was forever pardoning his enemies. After the Battle of Pharsalus, a whole contingent of senators decided that running in order to keep up the fight was pointless and supplicated themselves before Caesar, expecting the worst but hoping for the best. Caesar pardoned them all and declared it his greatest desire to simply heal the divisions within the state and reunite Rome as one body. Among those who begged forgiveness was Marcus Brutus, son of Caesar's old mistress Servilia, whom Caesar had long regarded affectionately as a stepson. He welcomed Brutus back to his side and told him to forget the past, that together they would build a new future for Rome. And this was exactly how he intended to handle his old friend Pompey the Great, just as soon as he caught him. So you can imagine Caesar's reaction when he landed in Alexandria in the autumn of 48 BC, hot on Pompey's heels, and instead of receiving information about which direction his rival had gone, he was instead presented with Pompey's head. The assassination denied Caesar his planned public relations coup de grace of pardoning Pompey and asking that he serve beside him, as together they repaired Rome and made the empire even greater than it had been before the Civil War. When he saw the head, he wept bitter tears, and to everyone's shock, ordered that it be buried with full honors. The ashes of Pompey's body were handed over to his grieving widow, who was allowed to return to Rome and perform the funeral rites becoming of a great hero. When Caesar was done mourning his old partner and one-time son-in-law, he turned to the ministers who had engineered the assassination. They were in big trouble. Alexandria had been founded in 334 BC by Alexander the Great, and since that time it had grown to become one of the most important cities of the ancient world, nearly as wealthy and populous as Rome itself. When Alexander died, his domains had been divided up by his former captains, with Egypt going to the general Ptolemy, and since then, the Ptolemaic dynasty had ruled the Nile from the growing cosmopolitan capital of Alexandria. The Greek-speaking Ptolemies made no effort to integrate with the locals and rarely left the safety of their palaces. But with the death of Ptolemy XII in 51 BC, the ruling dynasty was fractured. The dead king had decreed that his son and daughter ought to be co-rulers in the Egyptian tradition. But the same court ministers who would later assassinate Pompey had decided that the 10-year-old Ptolemy XIII would be far easier to control than his 18-year-old sister Cleopatra, and so worked diligently to marginalize her power. But Cleopatra was savvy, and, seeing that she was the target of palace intrigue, did something totally radical. She turned to the local Egyptians for support. She became the first of the Ptolemies to learn Egyptian and often took part in the local religious festivals in her role as queen. By ingratiating herself with the locals, the queen became even more dangerous to the ministers controlling her brother, and so, by the time Caesar arrived in Egypt, a full-blown civil war was underway, with Cleopatra exiled from the capital, leading an army of local Egyptians. But at that time in Egypt, support from the locals did not count for nearly as much as support from the Greeks in Alexandria, so her position was dicey at best. And this is why it had been such a huge mistake by the conspiring ministers to kill Pompey. It caused Caesar, in his disgust, to turn away from the young king they controlled and look for other allies in Egypt to support. Cleopatra fit the bill perfectly. So, rather than return to Rome and begin consolidating his power there, Caesar announced his intention to stay in Alexandria and settle the civil war. But placing an ally on the throne was not Caesar's only reason for staying in Egypt. His endless campaigning was expensive, and he needed money. With the rise of Rome, the Ptolemies maintained the independence of Egypt by issuing massive bribes to influential Romans, which in time included Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar. Caesar reminded young Ptolemy XIII that the last round of payments promised by his father had in no way been forgotten just because the old king had died. Ptolemy's ministers did everything they could to try to convince Caesar to leave, promising payments as soon as he was back in Rome, but Caesar would have none of it. He was more than content to wait for payment, and in the meantime, he could help them solve their little civil war. I'll bet they were thrilled. He called for Cleopatra to return to the royal palace to help sort out the conflict. But knowing that if she were to simply appear at the gates, it was likely that her brother's allies would have her killed before she could make it to the relative safety of Caesar's company. So she famously hid in what amounted to a laundry bag and had a loyal slave smuggle her into the palace. Caesar was immediately taken by the cunning young queen after she slipped through danger in such dramatic fashion. Declaring only to be executing the will of the dead Ptolemy XII, Caesar re-elevated Cleopatra to co-ruler, and not long after, the 21-year-old queen, for reasons of either politics or affection, became Caesar's mistress. The powers behind Ptolemy XIII, however, were not going to take this lying down, and concluded that they were going to have to expel the Romans by force. Caesar had brought with him to Alexandria only a single understaffed legion of some 4,000 infantry and around 800 cavalry. Reinforcements were on the way, but they were weeks out. So if the ministers were planning to drive Caesar away, they knew they needed to do it before the rest of his army arrived. So they whipped the local Alexandrians into a frenzy, declaring that Caesar was planning to make Egypt a province, depriving them all of the liberty and wealth to which they had grown accustomed. Nearly the whole city rose up in revolt and besieged the royal palace, which was held by Caesar and his men. What followed was weeks of bitter street fighting, as Caesar was forced to try and conquer and hold the neighborhoods around the palace, house by house, block by block. Nothing in their long careers prepared the Romans for the rigors of urban warfare. The cavalry was useless, and traditional troop deployments were unworkable. Their only advantage was that they were tougher and more disciplined soldiers than their opponents, and were able to withstand barrages from the locals as they moved to eradicate pockets of resistance. Eventually the Romans leveled whole blocks to create a no-man's land the Alexandrians would be suicidal to try and cross. The ticking clock was at the forefront of the Alexandrians' mind. While Caesar needed only to hold out until reinforcements arrived, the Alexandrians needed to win before the reinforcements arrived. But no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't break the Roman resistance. Caesar was able to maintain access to supplies by winning a naval battle in the harbor, but suffered casualties he could not afford in an ultimately successful but brutal assault on Pharos Island, home to one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Great Lighthouse of Alexandria. Finally, though, in January of 47 BC, word came that the Roman reinforcements had completed their overland march and were now on the outskirts of Egypt. Caesar slipped his besieged men out of the palace under cover of night, and along with a contingent of Cleopatra's Egyptian army, joined with the newly arrived legions to form an army of some 20,000. This combined force assaulted the base of young Ptolemy's army, which numbered around 20,000 itself. Used to fighting severely outnumbered, facing an army merely equal in size was a rare treat for Caesar's legions. The Battle of the Nile was easily won by the Romans. Ptolemy XIII drowned when the ship he was escaping on capsized, and Cleopatra was placed back on the throne. Caesar, though, never had any real intention of annexing Egypt. The wealth of Alexandria, combined with its now thoroughly anti-Roman citizenry, would prove a fertile center of rebellion no matter how loyal a governor Caesar installed. Better to leave it as a client kingdom, with Cleopatra in charge. The queen understood that she owed her position to Caesar, and Caesar alone. So he knew she might be the one person on earth he could trust not to rebel the first chance she got. But official province or not, Egypt was now firmly under Roman control. The Hellenistic dynasty of the Ptolemies that had ruled since Alexander the Great was, for all intents and purposes, broken. Rome's full encirclement of the Mediterranean was nearly complete. Because I left Caesar in such desperate straits at the end of the last episode, suffering through the winter with half an army deep in hostile territory, this week I think he deserves to be left in a slightly better place. So we'll leave him there in Egypt where, despite the fact that the remaining senatorial forces were regrouping in Numidia, the fact that Mark Antony's ruthlessly debauched management of Rome was turning the city into a hellhole, the fact that his appointed governor of Spain was so corrupt and brutal that the natives so recently won to Caesar's banner were in revolt, and the fact that nearly every territory Rome had ever pacified was planning to declare its independence at the first opportunity, Caesar took a month off in early 47 BC to enjoy a leisurely cruise up the Nile with Cleopatra. Next week, Caesar will go back to the exhausting business of consolidating power over the Roman Empire, but for now, let's leave him be. I think he's earned a vacation. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 45, The End of the War. In early 47 BC, after settling the civil war in Egypt and firmly establishing Roman dominance over the Nile, Caesar took a month-long cruise up the Great River with Cleopatra. Though no doubt relaxing, it was not simply an uncharacteristic vacation. Caesar took with him some 400 ships. The slow-moving entourage was meant to display the power of Rome to any Egyptian who may be planning resistance to the new regime. Caesar had a dozen major problems to deal with as he reshaped the political map of the ancient world. He did not need a revolt in newly pacified Egypt to become one of them. Of those major problems, his greatest lay near the remains of old Carthage, where the senatorial forces that had fled from Pharsalus were regrouping under the command of Metellus Scipio, who was building a massive army with the help of the Numidian king Juba. The problem was in fact so big that Caesar knew he could not face it right away. His men were exhausted, the cash supply was running dangerously low, and the entire eastern half of the empire seemed ready to revolt at a moment's notice. Plus, between the Battle of Pharsalus and the war in Alexandria, he had basically lost contact with Rome itself. The population, who had once received regular, glowing reports from Caesar during the Gallic Wars, had now gone more than 6 months without any updates at all. Before he could face his enemies in North Africa, Caesar would have to solidify his hold over every other corner of the empire, including the capital city itself. So, rather than marching west, Caesar took the road east out of Alexandria. His plan was to travel up the eastern Mediterranean coast, cross Asia Minor into Greece, and sail back across the Adriatic into Italy. Along the way, he would collect money, allies, soldiers, and support, and he would eliminate anyone who opposed him. For the most part, though, there was no opposition. Kings who had been clients of Pompey readily embraced Caesar as their new patron. Roman garrisons scattered across the east, most previously allied with the Senate, repudiated their old generals and begged clemency from Caesar, who was more than happy to grant it. But it was not all easy going. Pharnaces II, the son of Rome's old enemy Mithridates, had returned to Pontus and thought it right that he should be king. But to stake his claim, he had been forced to battle with the Roman garrison stationed there to keep an eye on Caesar's interests in the region. The Roman garrison, distracted by a desire to make for Egypt to reinforce their embattled general, had not taken the fight seriously, and Pharnaces had beaten them soundly. Now, in the great game of power politics, Caesar might have let this go and worked out a deal with Pharnaces to recognize his sovereignty over Pontus in exchange for not making trouble. But upon his ascension to the throne, the new Pontic king had made a point to track down any Roman citizen he could find and castrate them. This was a crime that Caesar could not let go unpunished. So as he traveled through Asia Minor, Caesar humored the Pontic envoys sent to work out a lasting peace. He replied with kind words and generous promises, but it was all merely a show to buy himself some time as he marched toward Pontus. The speed with which Caesar moved took Pharnaces off guard, and before he knew it, Caesar was at his doorstep. When the Romans arrived, though, Caesar's tone immediately changed. There would be no peace with a man who castrated Roman citizens. Pharnaces, who thought he was on the verge of a deal with Rome, quickly assembled his army as Caesar dug in outside the hill fort of Zela, where the Pontic king was holding court. The only hope for Pharnaces was a surprise attack before the Romans were firmly entrenched. So at dawn, while the legionaries dug trenches, the Pontic army poured out of the gates of the fort. At first, Caesar could not believe that they were really attacking, but it was soon obvious that this was no bluff. Throwing aside their shovels, the Romans tried to assemble as the enemy army hit. In the din of battle, it took longer than usual for the legions to get their act together, but once some order was imposed on the battle, the Romans quickly gained the upper hand. The Pontic army was destroyed, and Caesar let his men sack the town. Writing to a friend in Rome, Caesar described the campaign in Pontus simply, "I came, I saw, I conquered." Caesar continued west through Greece without incident, and soon enough landed on the shores of Italy. There to greet him in Brundisium was Cicero, who had gone home after the defeat of Pharsalus, and was now ready to face whatever punishment Caesar had in mind for him. But Caesar, who had tried his whole career to win Cicero over to his side, merely embraced the old senator and asked him to join him on the final leg of his journey so they could catch up. Back in Rome, Caesar's first order of business was removing Mark Antony from power. While he had been on campaign in the East, Caesar had been appointed dictator by what was left of the Senate, and Antony had been made master of the horse. And legally, when the dictator is absent, the word of a master of the horse becomes law, and Antony had let absolute power corrupt him absolutely. While Caesar had refused to revive the horrifying proscriptions that had marked the reigns of Marius, Cinna, and Sulla, his chief lieutenant showed no such restraint, and terror had gripped the city while Antony lived a lavish life of drunken excess, casually murdering his real or imagined enemies. But the bloody, debauched reign of Antony did have a silver lining. It made Caesar look great by comparison. All he had to do to win the people's affection when he came home was remove Antony from office. After bringing a measure of peace to the strife-torn city, he set aside the mantle of dictator and was again elected consul. He kept Antony on the political sidelines, though, and instead chose as his colleague an amiable and completely loyal cavalry commander named Marcus Lepidus. Those of you who read ahead to the next chapter know that in a few years, Lepidus will form the third leg of the second triumvirate, along with Antony and Caesar's great-nephew and heir, Gaius Octavius, the future Caesar Augustus. Satisfied that the eastern provinces were pacified and the situation in Rome was under control, Caesar finally turned his attention to the problem in North Africa. But just as he was getting started on the initial planning of an invasion, Caesar dealt with revolt from an unexpected corner, his own troops. The men who had conquered Gaul, secured Italy, sprinted across the continent to Spain and back, crossed the Adriatic in the middle of winter, defeated Pompey, taken Egypt, and then marched back home again, had finally had enough. Their paychecks were chronically late, and promises of discharge and land grants were forever just one more campaign away. When word came that Caesar was planning to lead them all in an invasion of North Africa, they mutinied. Marching north from their camps in southern Italy, they planted themselves just outside the gates of Rome with a list of demands. Against the advice of his friends, Caesar rode out alone to meet them. Standing in front of the assembled legions, the men who had been his family for a decade or more, Caesar calmly asked them what he could do to make them happy. Their tough talk about demanding gold and land melted away, and they told Caesar all they desired was to be discharged from service. In response, Caesar dealt them a cruel blow. He granted their request. Telling them he would handle the matters of back pay and land grants when he returned from Africa, he turned to leave the camp, and in bidding goodbye, he addressed them now not as my fellow comrades, but as my fellow citizens. It was too much to take. The soldiers were utterly shamed. Were they really deserting their general on the eve of his final battle? Were they really going to force Caesar to meet his enemies with only raw recruits to protect him? And if he won, were they really going to let those recruits march back to Rome in triumph and be awarded honors that had been secured by their own hard work and sacrifice? This hit them all in a rush as Caesar left the stage, and immediately calls went out for him to take them back. Caesar paused and let them twist in the wind for a heartbeat before returning to the stage. When we return from Africa, he told them, every man will be granted land and pay and be honorably discharged from service. But first, we must go to Africa, together. The soldiers exploded in cheers, shouting their thanks and promising him a great victory. So in early 46 BC, 2 years after crossing the wintry Adriatic, Caesar readied his legions for a similar winter crossing of the straits between Sicily and North Africa. While Metellus Scipio had gathered somewhere between 10 and 14 legions, Caesar once again charged into the belly of the beast completely outnumbered. Eager to make the crossing and establish a beachhead under Scipio's radar, Caesar set out from Sicily with but one legion. His men, terrified of drowning in the choppy sea, were overjoyed to see land appear on the horizon, but were horrified when they saw Caesar disembark onto the shores of Africa. While climbing from the ship, he became entangled in his cloak and fell face first onto the beach, a terrible omen to the superstitious Romans. But Caesar thought fast and tried to play off the mishap. According to Suetonius, he hugged the sand and cried, "I hold you now, Africa." For the first few months after landing, though, the omens seemed to prove true, and things went badly for Caesar. Reinforcements were continually being blown off course or captured by the senatorial forces. His legions already ashore were harassed constantly by detachments of Numidian cavalry who would strike and disappear with impunity. Access to supplies was terrible, and his foraging parties came back empty-handed or not at all. Caesar finally decided to move his men to the interior where food was more plentiful, but as soon as he began to march, the entire Numidian cavalry, led by Roman officers, appeared on the horizon. Caesar was forced to slowly retreat after being encircled and mocked by his rival commanders, but the attacking Numidians were unable to break Caesar's lines, and he made it to the high ground where horses were more of a hindrance than a help. They staved off attack and the Numidians retreated, but huddled amongst the rocks, bloody, tired, and hungry, it was looking like Caesar should have heeded the omen and just gone back to Italy. But he managed to hold his army together until spring, by which point the continuously arriving reinforcements finally gave him an army he felt he could go to battle with, rather than simply survive with. But of course, what looked to Caesar like a big enough army to go to battle with usually looked to everyone else like an army that would be easily overrun by 14 legions. It certainly looked that way to Metellus Scipio, right up until the moment his much larger army was completely destroyed. The decisive battle came at the port city of Thapsus, whose unique geography led both sides to think they were laying a clever trap for the other. The city itself lay on an isthmus, with the sea on one side and heavy marshes on the other, with only 2 narrow strips of dry land connecting the city to the mainland. When Caesar marched in and overran the garrison station there, Scipio jumped at the opportunity Caesar presented. All he had to do was blockade the narrow exits, and Caesar would be trapped. Unbeknownst to Scipio, however, this was exactly what Caesar wanted. By forcing the battle onto the narrow strips of land, Scipio's greater numbers would be negated, and the ferocity of Caesar's veteran legions would be the greatest factor in the fight, which is, of course, exactly how it happened. With King Juba marching to hold the southern escape route, Caesar massed his own army on the other side to face Scipio, who could not resist attacking. Just as Caesar planned, Scipio was unable to overwhelm Caesar's troops as they were forced to fight in a bottleneck. The battle soon turned into a bloodbath. Caesar's troops, believing that this was the really real last battle of the Civil War, were ferocious, and soon some 10,000 of Scipio's infantry lay dead, and his army was shattered. King Juba, realizing he had backed the wrong horse in the Roman Civil War, committed suicide upon hearing the news of Caesar's victory. Scipio tried to escape with the last remnants of his men, but drowned when his ship sank on its way to Spain. In Utica, the capital of the Roman province of Africa where all of this action was taking place, Cato received the news with characteristic stoicism. He had held the city for the Senate during the majority of the Civil War, despite the fact that its inhabitants were overwhelmingly pro-Caesar. Caesar's most implacable and incorruptible opponent knew that the end had come. He also knew that there was nothing Caesar liked more than pardoning his enemies and leaving them in his debt. Cato had no intention of giving him the pleasure. After setting his affairs in order, he retired for the evening with a copy of Plato's Phaedo, the dialogue that ends with Socrates drinking the hemlock tea. Cato had smuggled a knife into the tent with him, despite being searched by his son who feared his father's intentions, and plunged it into his stomach when he was done reading. When his body hit the floor, his friends came running and a doctor patched the old senator back together, but Cato was nothing if not stubborn. When he came to, he ripped out the bandages, causing enough damage that this time he died, defying Caesar one last time. After making sure he had nothing left to fear in Africa, Caesar returned to Italy in the summer of 46 BC and made his triumphal entrance into Rome. For all he had accomplished and all the battles he had won, Caesar had yet to celebrate an official triumph. He had thrown away his one opportunity years before when he chose to run for consul instead, a bold move at the time as triumphs were usually once-in-a-lifetime events for a Roman general. But perhaps to prove that he had been right to forego the opportunity, Caesar planned to celebrate his victories with not one, but 4 consecutive triumphs, one each to celebrate his victories in Gaul, Greece, Egypt, and North Africa. Coinciding with these great marches, Caesar threw lavish banquets and gladiatorial games. The wars were finally over. It was time to celebrate. The masses of Rome praised Caesar to the hilt and jumped headlong into his running party. They cheered as he hauled Vercingetorix out of the cell he had been languishing in and had him strangled. They laughed at giant depictions of all the foreign enemies he had beaten and marveled at the exotic creatures he put on display. But in the 4th and final triumph, Caesar finally made a mistake and pushed things too far. While the Romans had no problem cheering his victory over Egyptian eunuchs, when the floats bearing the images of dying Cato and fleeing Metellus Scipio came down the street, the mood of the masses changed. No one actually liked Cato, but should they really be reveling in the suicide of the great statesman? It made them think about who they were celebrating and what they were celebrating. Stability was wonderful and everyone was glad the Civil War was over. But what now? With Cato dead, was there anyone left to defend the Republic? Was there even a Republic left to defend? Caesar was surprised at the reaction. All he had done was dislodge the corrupt oligarchs who had sat parasitically on the top of the Roman political economy. The people ought to be offering toast after toast to the death of Cato. But here they were mourning him. It didn't make any sense. Caesar chose not to dwell on it. He had work to do. But the seeds of disenchantment had been planted. As I mentioned a few episodes ago, if the governing apparatus of the state was to fall into the hands of a single man, Rome could have done a lot worse than Julius Caesar. And as we will see down the line, Rome eventually does do quite a bit worse than Julius Caesar. While the Mark Antonys of the world see absolute power as a vehicle for personal indulgence, the Julius Caesars of the world see absolute power as a vehicle for total reform. Caesar saw in the old republican system a laundry list of injustices, irrationalities, and inefficiencies that did unnecessary harm to the people and the empire. He brought with him to power an ambitious agenda designed to right the ship of state. But where Sulla had attempted a similar righting of the ship by turning to the past, Caesar's eye was firmly on the future. The Republic was dead, and the outmoded ways it did business ought to die with it. If Rome was to rule what it had conquered, it needed a system-wide overhaul. The first thing on his agenda was a proper census. Since the start of the Civil War 3 years earlier, there had been massive upheavals in the population and economy. Families had moved, fled, had their property seized, moved back, resettled elsewhere, or been consumed by the violence and anarchy. No one had any real idea how many people actually lived in Rome, nor really who owned what anymore. Caesar sent agents from house to house to count every man, woman, and child and determine their citizenship status and income. The immediate issue was Caesar's suspicion that the free grain dole was being abused by non-citizen foreign residents and by citizens whose property disqualified them from state charity. When the numbers came back, they showed that while some 320,000 had been receiving grain allotments, only 150,000 actually qualified. So Caesar halved the free grain supply, instantly saving the state a huge quantity of money. And he was just getting started. Also contained within the census numbers, which showed a total population of some 900,000, Caesar also discovered that Rome had become economically unbalanced. There were a ton of poor laborers and a few rich nobles, but the middle class was badly underrepresented. So he instituted a dual policy to solve the problem. On the one hand, he offered citizenship to any foreign professionals who migrated to the city, while on the other hand, he set up a colonization program offering land to citizens who moved out to the provinces. Over the next few years, some 80,000 members of the urban poor took Caesar up on his offer and moved out of the city, while teachers and doctors from across the empire resettled in the capital. It was a win-win-win for everyone. Skilled professionals received citizenship, poor workers moved out of the slums and onto small farms, and Rome itself became more prosperous. At the same time, Caesar took care of his loyal soldiers and lived up to his promise to release them and grant them back pay and land. As much as he loved them, though, he made sure to scatter the veteran settlements across the whole of the empire. There is nothing more dangerous than congregating veterans. Eventually, they get ideas. He also followed through on one of the promises he had made to his foreign allies while he traveled the empire during the wars, that if he won, Roman citizenship would be the prize of victory. Caesar had always seen restrictions on citizenship as a great hindrance to the empire, benefiting only the nobles who jealously hoarded power. Having already granted citizenship to the population of his old province of Cisalpine Gaul during the early stages of the war, Caesar liberally granted citizenship to his allies and men he hoped to become his allies across the multinational empire. Not only did it bind the men personally to Caesar, but in the future it would bind their families to Rome. Citizenship in the empire meant that potentially seditious elements in Syria or Spain or Greece would now see their interests aligned with Rome's. Caesar had the vision to see that the empire would not survive if it remained simply a Roman empire. It must embrace its growing multi-ethnic character, or it would inevitably fracture. To this end, he also expanded the ranks of the depleted Senate to some 1,000 members, and to the horror of old conservatives, welcomed into the august body important, read, loyal to Caesar, men from across the empire, regardless of their national origins. After taking care of all of these human questions, enfranchisement, grain doles, colonization, Caesar turned to the physical infrastructure of the empire. The city had been crumbling, and as in the case of the old Senate House, been deliberately destroyed in the chaos of the previous few years. Caesar initiated a slew of public works projects, rebuilding and expanding the neglected city. But he had his eye not just on Rome itself. Caesar personally drew up plans for an expanded and rationalized harbor at the poorly conceived but vitally important port of Ostia. He also initiated a program to drain the swamps around Italy, which he saw as little more than factories for malaria. The modernization program was bold and far-reaching, but perhaps his boldest and farthest-reaching program was to reimagine the nature of time itself. Since its inception, Rome had operated on a lunar calendar. To handle the lag between the 355-day lunar year and the 365-day solar year, the high priests were forever inserting holy days to keep the months and years aligned. But in the chaos of the war years, the calendar had been neglected and things were completely out of whack. Caesar decided to prevent this from ever happening again by officially moving Rome onto a solar calendar. Using a Greek astronomer's calculations, he declared a 12-month, 365-day year with a leap day scheduled every 4 years. Sound familiar? The Julian calendar would remain in effect in the West until the 1500s, when it was tweaked by Pope Gregory to reflect the subtle drift of the equinoxes over the centuries. But in substance, we live today in the calendar that Julius Caesar declared unilaterally in 46 BC. The month of July, Julii, should tell us everything we need to know about the impact of Caesar's vision. There is little doubt that Caesar's reforms had a net positive impact on the empire, and coupled with the subsequent overhauls initiated by Augustus, his policy set the stage for another 5 centuries of Roman dominance over the Mediterranean basin. But there was still the little matter of how all of these necessary reforms were being executed. It had been 500 years since the Romans had driven out Tarquinius Superbus and founded their republic, believing that never again should one man hold absolute power over his countrymen. On what authority was Caesar really acting? What were his real intentions? When the crowds in the street hailed him as Rex Caesar, and he casually waved them off, was he waving off their attempts to crown him, or waving off their attempts to crown him as simply premature? Next week, we will get more into the specifics of Caesar's legal authority through this period, but suffice it to say that a growing contingent of the waning nobility did not believe for a second Caesar's claims that he would restore the old order as soon as order itself was restored. When a group of senators called on Caesar one afternoon and he did not rise to greet them as equals, but instead remained seated in lordly fashion, they saw their worst fears confirmed. Caesar was aiming to make himself a king and a god, and he must be stopped. And though Caesar was clearly aiming for immortality, they knew that in fact he was just a man who could and must be killed. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 46, Sic Semper Tyrannis. In 46 BC, Julius Caesar stayed in Rome for an extended period for the first time since heading to Gaul some 12 years earlier. During the summer, he was joined by Queen Cleopatra, who visited the city as an honored guest. Somewhat awkwardly for Caesar, she brought with her the product of their affair, a small boy nicknamed Caesarion, or Little Caesar, who would prove to be the great general's only son. Though Cicero found her infuriating, and Calpurnia could not have been happy to see her husband's lover parading around their illegitimate child, Cleopatra charmed the city, and was formally made a friend of Rome by the Senate. The Roman envelopment of Egypt, long sought and long staved off by bribery, was now official. Through the spring and summer, Caesar worked furiously on his reform projects, trying to salvage the Roman economy and restore stability to the empire. I would like to thank alert listener Dave for pointing out an error I made last week in recounting the changes to the calendar. It turns out that Caesar actually got his math wrong and inserted a leap day every 3 years rather than every 4 years. The mistake would stand for another 30 years until the reforms of Augustus. And speaking of corrections, I would also like to thank alert and longtime listener Detlef for pointing out that I got crossed up on my Roman numerals a few episodes back and referred to Mithridates the Great as Mithridates the Sixth rather than Mithridates the Fourth. Thanks, guys, for helping me keep everything straight. At this point, Caesar still officially served as co-consul with Lepidus as his colleague, and had not yet embraced the full-time role of dictator that he would be remembered for. But while technically he was just another average Republican executive, in reality, the word of mere consul Julius Caesar was the undisputed law of the land. It felt good to finally wield the power he had sought for so long, and it felt doubly good that for the first time in years there were no enemies on the horizon threatening to take it all away. As he remade the city, though, he received new reports of trouble in Spain. At first, he hoped to simply brush them aside. He had won the war. He was in power. He did not want to hear that the sons of Pompey were raising more legions in Hispania to challenge his rule. Finally, though, he was forced to acknowledge the problem when word came that the ragtag remnants of the Senate's North African army was now 13 legions strong. Sigh. So in the autumn of 46 BC, Caesar set out from the city once again with 2 of his veteran legions, marching to Spain in less than a month, gathering recruits along the way and joining with a force that had been raised in anticipation of his arrival. In the end, he marshaled some 40,000 to face off against the 70,000 raised by the Pompeys. Outnumbered again. Sigh. But the speed of his advance had taken his enemies by surprise, and Caesar was able to reclaim much of the territory taken by the Pompey brothers. With Caesar in country, and clearly every bit the general he had always been, soldiers on the other side began to get nervous and defect in droves. The Pompeys found themselves forced to challenge Caesar in battle immediately. If they waited any longer, they risked losing their whole army to defection. So in March of 45 BC, on a slope outside the fortified city of Munda, the two sides met. Caesar was in the weaker position, but like always he acted boldly and ordered his legions to charge up the hill. The battle was an extremely hard-fought, bloody affair. Caesar himself was recorded to have said afterwards that while he usually fought for victory, at Munda he fought for his life. Indeed, the battle was going against him for quite a while, until he personally took charge of the right wing and rallied his beleaguered troops. The Pompeians reinforced the line in the face of Caesar's counterattack, but wound up losing the left as a result, allowing Caesar's cavalry to break through and surround them. Engulfed, the Pompeian army broke. The final numbers of 30,000 dead Pompeians to a mere 1,000 for Caesar hide how close Caesar came to losing everything. But what hid nothing was the 13 legionary standards Caesar captured. Military resistance in Spain was shattered, and the sons of Pompey fled. One would be captured a few months later and executed, while the other would remain on the run for another decade before being caught and executed by Octavian. Caesar remained in Spain for a few months, consolidating his rule and repairing the damage done by the corrupt and ruthless governor he had left in charge after winning the province in 49 BC. Then, with autumn approaching and the situation in Spain dealt with, Caesar and his entourage headed back to Rome. Unlike his return to the city after the Alexandrian campaign, or after his victory at Thapsus, when he headed back to the capital this time, nowhere in the whole of the empire did there lurk an enemy army to challenge him. This time, he really was the undisputed master of Rome. But of course, it does not take an army to bring down a single man. With every opposition army destroyed, Caesar's enemies turned to conspiracy. The object now was not to defeat Caesar, but to kill him. At first, it was only a hardcore contingent of enemies who thirsted for Caesar's blood, but his attitude after becoming sole master of the empire alienated many who were ambivalent to his rule and embittered many who had been his greatest friends. Mark Antony, though, despite the recent falling out with his old friend and numerous overtures from the conspirators, refused to join the ranks of the disaffected plotters. His continued loyalty was well received, and on his way back to Rome from Spain, with his young great-nephew Octavian by his side, Caesar picked up Antony from his political doghouse in Gaul, and the two old friends patched things up. But while Antony's support never wavered, a man in whom Caesar's support for never wavered, Marcus Brutus, would soon find himself at the forefront of the plot to kill his would-be father figure. The main controversy surrounding Caesar after his return to Rome in September of 45 BC, and the one that was the primary catalyst for his assassination, was the question of whether or not he was planning to have himself crowned king. Not being a dummy, Caesar always went to great lengths to prove that he had no desire to establish a monarchy, but the rumor persisted, and overt attempts to so crown him kept popping up, quote-unquote, spontaneously. Throughout the year 45, while he continued to serve officially as consul, this time he had not bothered with the formality of naming a colleague, and he seemed to be drifting more and more towards overt autocracy. And unfortunately for Caesar, just as his attitude was becoming more haughty, his grasp of public relations, once his greatest asset, began to slip. First, Caesar proved that he had learned nothing from the outrage over his last triumph and staged an official event to celebrate his victory in Spain. Again, the people of Rome were dismayed by a parade glorifying the defeat of their countrymen. The sons of Pompey may have been personal enemies of Caesar, but were they really public enemies of Rome? Second, Caesar managed to get himself embroiled in a pointless public spat with Cicero over the legacy of Cato. The great orator had published a eulogy of his dead colleague, lavishly praising the old defender of the Republican faith. Caesar flew into a rage, and against all good sense, wrote a scathing reply called the Anti-Cato, in which he lobbed every smear he could think of against his old rival. Cicero was taken aback by the fury of Caesar's reaction, but delighted in how unhinged the attack seemed. Cato may have been a lot of things, but a drunken miser who pimped his wife was not among them, though the latter charge, through some tortured logic, had some basis in truth. Cato had divorced his wife so she could marry another, richer man, and then, when the new husband died, remarried her and reaped the rewards of her inheritance. The people of Rome, though, did not see what Caesar wanted them to see about Cato. They focused instead on his petulant hysterics, a side of Caesar they had never seen before and did not like. His enemies could not print copies of the Anti-Cato fast enough. In the midst of these public offenses, little things kept popping up that renewed fears of Caesar's monarchical ambitions, and despite his protests, he certainly began to act the part of king. He secured the right to wear his triumphal regalia at public games, which may have seemed like no big deal, but the triumphal regalia was purple, just like the royal robes of old. Add to this the golden throne he had installed in the Senate House to sit in, and a pattern started to emerge. To top things off, he ordered that a statue of himself be carried along with the procession of gods that would make its way through the city on holy days. So not only was he planning to make himself king, but he was already claiming to be a god. One morning, the citizens of Rome awoke to find that someone had placed a crown on a public statue of Caesar during the night. Two tribunes, vocal opponents of Caesar, ordered that the crown be removed and made a great fuss about the outrage. And not long after this incident, while he made his way through town, Caesar was hailed as king by a man in the crowd. The same two tribunes had the man hauled off to stand trial, but Caesar ordered the man freed, and instead turned his wrath against the two agitating tribunes, stripping them of their property and forcing them to resign from office. What remains a mystery is whether Caesar himself planted first the crown and then the man in the crowd as trial balloons, or whether the two tribunes, hoping to score political points, engineered both events, or whether one was engineered by one side and the other by the other, or whether they were both just signs of organic public support for a King Caesar. Whoever had done what, though, talk of monarchy was in the air. For many who would take part in the assassination plot, though, the last straw was when a group of senators came to bestow upon Caesar a long list of new honors, father of the fatherland, imperator, that sort of thing, and Caesar had failed to rise to greet them. There are conflicting reports about whether Caesar was sick at the time and the whole incident was blown out of proportion by his enemies, or whether he simply miscalculated the depths of the Senate's new subservience. But regardless, the story got out and the rumor mill was fed. Caesar downplayed all this kingly talk, but continued to consolidate power at the same time. He stepped down from the consulship in October and placed 2 loyal politicians in the office, bypassing both the Senate and public elections. But his successors were just placeholders. Next, he had the Senate formally appoint him dictator, but unlike his previous flirtations with the office, this time he would not be stepping down anytime soon. He was granted a sequence of 10 consecutive one-year terms as dictator. But even this proved not to be enough, and in early 44 BC, he cast aside the expiration date and had himself named dictator in perpetuity, dictator for life. He may not be a king, but it was in name only. And even the in name only part seemed destined to be cast aside, as Caesar had a priest announce a contrived prophecy that only a king could conquer the Parthian Empire. And everyone knew that Caesar was planning, with the full support of the Roman people, to launch a war with Parthia to revenge the losses of Crassus. So if they wanted the mission to succeed, well, you heard the prophecy. But the movement to make Caesar a king seems to have died in February of 44 BC, during a rather strange, it was even considered strange by Roman standards, religious festival that involved men running through the streets naked. Mark Antony produced a laurel crown, announcing that the people had asked him to offer it to Caesar. But the reception from those same people seemed to indicate that they felt exactly the opposite. Roman crowds cheered when they approved of something and were silent when they did not. When Antony offered the crown, you could have heard a pin drop. Caesar immediately read the crowd's reaction and used the opportunity not to crown himself monarch as he may have planned, but to declare forcefully that Jupiter alone was the king of Rome. At this, the crowd exploded in cheers. They may accept autocracy, but they would never accept monarchy. Whether or not it was Caesar's plan all along to win support of the masses by engineering a very public rebuke of monarchy, it was clear that a king would not be conquering Parthia anytime soon. It was a good thing for Caesar that the prophecy was a complete fabrication. The last months of Caesar's life were consumed with this planned invasion of Parthia. He had already moved 16 legions and 10,000 cavalry across the Adriatic, and was preparing to launch his campaign in April of 44 BC. What Caesar had in mind seemed crazy for a man nearing the age of retirement, but his self-confidence was unwavering, and he dreamed of nothing less than the greatest series of conquests in Roman history, conquests to rival Alexander himself. Caesar planned to invade Parthia via Armenia, and after defeating the Parthians, which he took to be a foregone conclusion based off of what he had seen of their armies while passing through the east, he would march north through the Caucasus, pacifying the fierce nomadic tribes of the steppes, and then follow the Danube River back into Europe, capping off his run by conquering Germania. His plan, in short, was to return to Italy the greatest Roman who had ever lived. If only he had lived. Caesar's enemies realized that time was running out for them to do something. It could be years before he was back in Rome, and if he managed to accomplish half of what he was setting out to do, there would be no stopping him upon his return. The people would beg Caesar to be their king. The Republic would be destroyed forever. The time to act was now. In the months since Caesar's victory in Spain, the list of conspirators had grown to some 60 names. Some, like Cassius, were on board because they had been Caesar's enemies from the start. Others, like Gaius Trebianus, had been with Caesar from the time of the Gallic Wars, but felt sidelined in his new regime. In his zeal to embrace his enemies, Caesar had pushed aside the friends who had got him to where he was. To men like Trebianus, Caesar was no longer a vehicle for their own personal ambition, but rather an obstacle in its path. Finally, there were men like Marcus Brutus, the tortured Judas of the Ides of March, who seems to have simply been a Republican idealist pushed into the plot by domineering friends. They reminded him constantly of his ancestor Marcus Junius Brutus, who had led the revolution against the Tarquins and sworn the Romans to their sacred oath of opposing monarchy forever. Every night, on a statue of that Brutus, graffiti would appear, asking if the Brutus name was dead. Though he loved Caesar personally, Brutus finally caved to the pressure and agreed to join the plot and exploit the fact that he was the last person Caesar would suspect of treachery. For the most part, The collection of plotters were personal rivals who, on any normal day, would have had nothing to do with each other. But this was no ordinary day. Today, they all agreed that Caesar must be killed. Numerous assassination scenarios were hashed out, but the conspirators finally settled on a meeting of the Senate as the right time and place. Only senators would be allowed into Pompey's theater, which is where the body had temporarily moved to, leaving Caesar without the protection of his bodyguards. Formal senatorial togas would also allow the assassins to easily conceal their daggers, the agreed-upon murder weapon. The plan was simple: lure Caesar into the Senate, surround him, and then stab him to death. With Caesar planning to leave Rome in just a few days, the conspirators also set a date, the 15th of March. Being the midpoint of the month, the 15th was also known by the name we are all familiar with today, the Ides of March. Caesar awoke on the morning of the 15th and tried to go about his business as usual. There were final preparations to sort out before he left for the East, and the Senate had been called into the session that day so that he could review some new petition. Caesar had been warned previously by a soothsayer to be on guard on the Ides of March, and he was further troubled by the fevered nightmares of his wife Calpurnia, who had dreamed just that night of his death. His wife and friends begged him to listen to the ill omens that surrounded the day and stay home, and while Caesar considered the option, he was convinced by his old surrogate son Brutus that to ignore the Senate's request for his presence would be seen as a great insult. They were already assembled and awaiting his appearance. To simply blow them off would be the height of bad manners, and feed royal rumors. Caesar was convinced. He would go and humor the old men one last time before leaving for the simple comforts of his military tent. The worst he was likely to suffer listening to whatever overwrought petition the Senate had deemed worthy of his attention was acute boredom. The petition, of course, was a fake, entered for public consideration by the plotting senators to lure their prey into a trap. Caesar made his way through the streets, carefully led by Brutus. Mark Antony had learned the night before that some plot was afoot, though he did not know the details of the plan, and hurried to try and warn Caesar, but Brutus carefully steered the dictator in through a back door. Antony was unable to reach him through the crowd. Caesar took his place at the front of the chamber and requested the petition. The senator who brought the scroll forward handed it over, but as he did so he grabbed at Caesar's toga. Caesar was shocked by the move and exclaimed, "Why, this is violence." With Caesar held in place, another senator named Servilius Casca approached from behind and, pulling a dagger from his robes, stabbed at Caesar's throat. Military instinct taking over, Caesar dodged the attack and seized Casca's arm, crying, "Casca, you villain, what are you doing?" Casca, having lost the element of surprise, called out for his brothers to help him. At this word, the 60 members of the conspiracy rushed in and surrounded Caesar, stabbing at him recklessly. Caesar tried to run, but blinded by blood and confusion, tripped and fell. As he lay on the ground, the stabbing continued. In the end, all Caesar could do was cover his face with his toga and die in a pool of his own blood. The legend surrounding the assassination has Caesar in anguish seeing Brutus among his attackers and crying either, "You too, child?" or, in Shakespeare's poetic turn, "Et tu, Brute?" But these last words did not begin to appear in the historical record until much later, and even then, as in the case of Suetonius, the quotes are simply noted but dismissed as inaccurate. A similar embellishment has Brutus crying, "Sic semper tyrannus," thus always to tyrants, over Caesar's dead body. Dramatic and memorable, yes, but a complete fiction. Instead, the assassins are reported to have simply marched out of the chamber, leaving Caesar's body behind. They are said to have then paraded through the streets, announcing that they had killed Caesar and set Rome free. But to their surprise, they were not met as the liberators they imagined themselves to be. The people of Rome greeted them instead with stunned silence. Then they went home. Then they locked their doors. They knew that whatever stability Caesar had brought was about to be blown apart. Julius Caesar died on the 15th of March, 44 BC. He had been stabbed 23 times, though doctors determined that in the end, only a single thrust to his heart had been fatal. He was the last and greatest of the old triumvirs, but in the end, just like Crassus and Pompey before him, he died a violent death, a victim of his own outsized ambition. For a brief moment, the fate of Rome hung in the balance. Would the liberators, as they were now calling themselves, see their dream of a restored republic come true, Or would Julius Caesar be revealed as merely a symptom of the disease that plagued Rome, rather than the cause? Next week, the full extent of the rot at the core of the republican system will be revealed. Mark Antony will turn the people against the supposed liberators, reminding the masses that all Caesar had ever done was remove the unjust chains placed upon them by greedy oligarchs. Brutus and Cassius, who fancied themselves heroes, will be driven from the city they thought they had saved, and Caesar's revealed heir, Gaius Octavius, the bright young great-nephew of the dead dictator, will make his first appearance on the public stage. The Romans will be forced to endure another 13 years of chaos and civil war before they are once again granted peace. After all the violence, it will not matter to anyone that the peace will be guaranteed by the rule of a single man, Gaius Octavius, Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of Rome.